So, ladies and gentlemen, virtually all seats taken. That's nice. Thank you for being here. My name is Jan-Jaap Indermauer, JJ for international friends. I'm a moderator at Masters in Moderation, and I will be moderating you through this session. Before we start with our speaker, I would like to take a quick test in how tech savvy you are. Could you all take out your mobile phones, please? Or your tablets, or whatever gets you connected to the internet. And could you please go to Slido? There's two ways of doing that. You can go to slido.com and then enter hashtag IBTM Vibe. Or you can go to the conference app if you have it installed, and there is one specific button saying Slido, and then you can look this session up. I will give you a minute to get this sorted out, because you are not all millennials. And the person on my left laughing the loudest is probably... Can I see a raise of hands who is not in Slido yet? Anyone connected to everyone connected to Slido? Yes, there is a poll there, and I would like you to answer the poll. Are you A millennial? Are you B, a Generation Edge? Are you none of the above? Or do you have no clue what this question means? There are some very brave people telling us that they have no clue what it means. We have 17 votes in. We will take it to, well, let's say at least 30. Well, it's about roughly 25% to all four answers. Great information to the speaker. The speaker knows what this means, because he's the expert, and that's why he's here. He knows what lies in the future. At the BBC they know that, at Sky News they know that, at ABC they know that, because this man is in the media regularly, being a commentator and author on the future. At many large companies and organizations, they know that he knows what is in the future, because they hire him as an advisor. He is a respected, what we call, social futurist. He is an author. He is the chairman of the 2020 Plus international think tank. Ladies and gentlemen, social futurist Mal Fletcher.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that operatic clapping. I appreciate it. It's great to see you all here today. Thank you. Please come in if you can find a seat. If you can't, I'm sure someone will allow you to share theirs. I flew into Barcelona last night. I fly out again straight after this session, but I love the winter here. It's a bit tough. You've got to suffer in the winter here in Barcelona. When you come from London, it's a nice change. I've been asked to speak to you today on what we're calling the generation game, attracting, teaching, empowering Generation X, Millennials, and Generation Edge. I will define each of those as we go along. If future-minded technologists have their way, within about 20 years of now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll all be living in smart cities, working in smart industries, part of Industry 4.0. We'll all be living in streets that we negotiate using augmented reality, driving in cars that are fueled at least in part by big data, and where the traffic is controlled using the Internet of Things. We'll all be living and working in self-contained hydroponic farms with walls that breathe to cool us and warm us in the winter, and glass that changes reflectivity according to the amount of light available. How close are we to the truly smart city or smart industry? Well, in my profession, that's a subject of debate. But one thing I know for absolutely certain, and that is that technology is not destiny. That is to say, we are not, in future terms, a product of the technologies we use. We are a product of how we choose to use them. It's human choice, isn't it, that makes the difference between a wonderful future in any industry or sector and something less desirable in the future. And human choice is shaped by many things, and one of the least acknowledged of those is one of the areas I want to touch on with you today, and that is generational change, or generational characteristics, generational traits. Every generation has its own biography, from childhood to adolescence to adulthood to middle age to eldership. And by sharing certain common experiences through a particular era in history, every generation develops certain shared characteristics. And please understand today, when we talk generationally, we must, by definition, talk in generic terms. So please don't take anything that I'm saying today too personally. It's generic. There are 5 generations that have influence in the world today. 4 in particular have influence in corporate life. Those 4 are the baby boomers, of which I am a part. Do I have any other baby boomers here today? Baby boomers born in the so-called baby boom after the Second World War here in Europe. Aged today between mid-50s and early 70s for the most part. Following us is a group that has been called Generation X after the book by Douglas Copeland, in which he postulated that his generation didn't understand its place in the system, hence the name. And they are aged today in Europe between about the mid-30s and the mid-50s, early 50s. Following that, we have the ubiquitous millennial generation, which some call Generation Y, but millennials don't much like the term Generation Y, so I'm going to use millennial because they came of age during the turn of the millennium. They are aged today between early 20s and mid-30s. Some of you I know will have millennials in your team, some of you will be millennials. Then we have a generation, the research about which is only just now coming to light, and we've been doing a lot of it ourselves at 2020 Plus. I call it Generation Edge. Some people call it Generation Z, and then I guess we have to start the letters all over again with A. But we call them Gen Edge because they are on the edge of some of the greatest changes and opportunities that humankind will face in modern times. And we'll talk about them in just a moment. I want to concentrate our attention on the last 3 of those. Very briefly, I'll touch on Generation X, talk a little more about millennials, and finally about Generation Edge, looking at the influences on each of these generations, the characteristics that have emerged as a result, what these mean for the future of any sector or industry and for society as a whole, and finally what we as leaders can do to create the cultural architecture that will engage and empower these generations. I'm a big believer that there's a difference between management and leadership. It is essentially that management, which is vital to any enterprise, is fundamentally about metrics, spreadsheets and targets, and all of that is important, but leadership is about mindset. Managers, when they do their job well, are structural engineers, but leaders are cultural architects. And so I want to look at the architecture that we create to engage, to attract, and to keep these generations. One of the great revolutions of our time, ladies and gentlemen, is the globalism or globalization revolution. Every week now we add 3 million people to the cities of this world. 51% of the world's population right now is living in a major urban center. By 2060, more than 70% of India will be living in cities. The Chinese government expects 260 million people to move into cities that don't even exist today, but are being planned right now. Urbanism is an important plank of globalization. So is migration or mobility. 244 million people are living outside their city of birth or country of birth today. I'm one of them. Having come from Australia, having lived in Northern Europe, I now live in the UK. I'm an economic migrant looking for new opportunities for my family. But of course, a growing number of migrants now are refugees and asylum seekers. That is not surprising when you consider that 8% of the world wealth is held by 82% of the wealth is held by 8% of the people. And in the age of Instagram, it's not hard for someone to get a photo of life on the other side of the tracks and say, I'd like a little bit of that action. Thank you very much. Globalism as we know it first began to emerge at the same time that Generation X began to appear on the scene. And the combination of globalism and the so-called sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s added to the emphasis on self-actualization that came with the baby boom generation gave us an environment of great fluidity in which Generation X was born. We were more fluid than ever in terms of our commitment to a set of mores as a society. We became more diverse in that regard. We were more fluid in terms of our commitment to one place and our commitment to one family. which, if you put it all together, meant that we had a new generation, Generation X, that was first of all demographically smaller than the boomers were. It's also smaller than millennials, by the way, which is why many Gen Xers do feel a little bit sandwiched in between two very big cohorts of people. It's also, generically speaking, a less well-nurtured generation than the boomers were in its childhood. Now, I don't have time to share with you all the research on that. In the 1980s, I founded a youth organisation in Australia which grew in 10 years to represent more than 60,000 young adults. This was at a time when our country had the worst suicide rate for teenagers in the developed world. And we were dealing with Generation X teenagers. We did a lot of research on what became known as the latchkey kids. Young people who'd come home, have no one to talk to for hours on end because their parents were, I guess, actualizing their inner potential. In the early days, trying to work out how we combine career with children. It's a very diverse generation, very eclectic in its approach to everything from music to food to philosophy and religion. It's a very pragmatic generation, and if you're in business, this is essential that you know this, particularly if you're a baby boomer like me. If you're a baby boomer CEO and you have Gen X managers, often the clash is because you're a boomer who believes in the dream, the vision. I have a dream, caught the attention of boomers. Ask not what your country can do for you, caught the attention of boomers, because boomers generically are idealistic. But Gen Xers are much more pragmatic. They want the rubber to hit the road. They want to know how you're going to make it happen. They're not institutional. How many have ever seen the TV program Friends? 3 people. Wow, educated crowd. How many people have seen Friends? Thank you very much. Friends was the #1 show in the 1990s throughout the United States of America and much of the world. Why? Because it was made by Gen Xers, for Gen Xers, about what Gen X wants most, which is belonging. It's a very communal, non-institutional generation. So how do we attract and keep Gen Xers? How do we get the best from this, I think, very exciting cohort of people? We need to have strategic cultures in place, is the short answer. 33% of CEOs in 2009 globally, in a major survey, said that they had no confidence in the plans for their company's future, plans which they had been involved in building. This is where Generation X gives us an advantage. Because they are pragmatic, they're much more inclined to be able to answer the worst case scenario questions. I don't know if you've seen the short teasers for the new movie called Sully. Has anybody seen those? Stars Tom Hanks, directed by Clint Eastwood. It's the true story, of course, of Chesley Sullenberger, who in 2009 landed a plane on the Hudson River in New York City, saved 155 lives, and when the media said to him, "You're a hero," he said, "I don't feel like a hero. I'm a pilot. We do worst case scenario stuff all the time." And I suggest to you, if worst case scenario thinking can save lives, it can certainly save a business. And yet less than 30% of CEOs in Europe today say they give any time on a daily basis to thinking strategically about the future. Gen X is very good at asking the worst case scenario question. What's the worst thing that can happen to our project in the next 6 months? What will we do the day after that happened? What characteristics or conditions would lead up to that event? How can we get ahead of those so that they don't happen? Generation X is also very good at scenario mapping, setting proximate as distinct from distant goals, fighting the battle before you as distinct from the battle you wish you were facing. A lot of companies, and I would gather in your sector as much as any others, are fighting battles that were fought 50 years ago in the sector, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, but the world has moved on. And Gen X is very good at making that distinction. It's also good at what we call mutuality, allowing the private in the army the right to challenge the general. It's actually a very strong trait of Generation X, that need for mutuality, which we might come to again in a moment when we talk about Generation Edge. One of the other big revolutions of our time, of course, is the digital revolution, driven by the digital economy. Do you know that in 1986, the world's technological capacity to store information was at the level of 2.5 billion gigabytes globally. By 2007, that had jumped up to 295 billion gigabytes globally, but today, every day, we add 2.5 times 10 to the power 18. That's 2.5 quintillion bytes, keystrokes, of information to the global database we call the internet. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a staggering amount of information. And the digital revolution has helped to birth a new generation we call the millennials. Again, aged between early 20s and about mid-30s. It's quite an optimistic generation, even in spite of some of the pressures it faces right now. In a survey a few years ago here in Europe, millennials were asked which two groups of people will have the biggest impact on the future. The top two answers were scientists and millennials. These guys really believe that if given the right technologies, in collaboration with their peers, they can build a better society. It's a talented generation. It's a resourceful generation. By 2020, we'll have more spending power than any other generation on Earth, including the baby boomers. It's a large generation. By 2025, 3 out of every 5 workers globally will be a millennial. So they're important to our sector. It's an innovative generation. This may surprise you. In a survey just 2 years ago, 46% of millennials, not in the United States, but in Europe, said, I want to start my own business. 46%. You might expect that. I would in the United States of America. But 46% is a high percentage here, I suggest to you, in Europe. It's very inventive. It's a very collaborative generation. This is the generation that is driving what we now call open innovation, where we see, global problems being solved using convergent solutions. So we have medicine working with IT, working with additive manufacturing, 3D printing, to give us the possibility that in maybe 8 years from now, we will produce a kidney or a lung for transplant purposes using a version of a 3D printer. In 15 years, we expect to do that with a heart. That's remarkable, and it will be millennials who drive these changes. It will be millennials that get the most out of the Internet of Things. Some people think the Internet of Things is pie in the sky, but we know it's already happening in smart homes and some offices. We already, though, on Earth have more devices hooked up to the Internet than we do people. So it isn't far away. Big data. It's the millennials that I suggest will get the most out of big data analytics. They will be able to take, and they are taking, technologies in a collaborative sense to do things like micro-volunteering. How many of you recently have gone online, typed the squiggly letter into the box to prove you're not a robot? Well, many of you, some of you will know you are, but others will not be conscious of the fact that you're part of the capture or recapture program, which originated in the United States. It's part of a worldwide effort to translate analog books into digital books, one word or one letter at a time. So rather than sitting a few thousand people down to do this non-stop for months on end, they're having you and I micro-volunteer. We as individuals are making a small commitment to the public good, which collectively has a huge impact. 100 million words a day are being translated that way right now, something like 2.5 million books every year. It will be millennials who drive this as we go forward and get the most out of it. They're responsible for the sharing economy. How many of you have ever shared-owned anything in a major city? Right. You go to London, where I live, and you can share-own a car, a bicycle, Boris bike, an electric bicycle, a motor scooter. You can share-own an apartment or a room within an apartment now. Even education has gone shared ownership with the emergence of the MOOC. You familiar with the MOOC? Massive open online course. Harvard, Stanford, MIT working together to provide free courses to anybody who has access to the internet. Exciting stuff. Now in London we have the MOMC, Massive Open Mobile Course, where you take an entire course through an app on your phone, and at the end you're given a nano degree, which I kind of think sounds sexy, to have a nano degree. It's the millennials that are driving the sharing economy, ladies and gentlemen. How do we attract and keep millennials? Most obvious first answer is we need to build cultures that are technologically inclined, using the best of the modern technologies for the best of the company's purposes. Marshall McLuhan in the 60s famously said that in the age of television, the medium is the message. It doesn't matter how good your ideas are, if your media are out of date, people will assume your ideas are out of date. And if that was true in the age of television, my friends, that is more true in the age of digital technology. You see, for these guys, millennials, technology is the new rock and roll. Anybody here old enough to remember when people used to line up down the street to buy a new record album when it first came out? Anybody like me who walked with the dinosaurs? Come on. Thank you. The honest ones. We're the tired-looking ones here today. Well, we don't do that anymore. But people used to buy albums, go home, listen, sometimes in groups, and if the music had some social consciousness message to it, often we would decide to do something about that, all around the music. Because music was the hub around which social change occurred for the boomer generation, but not for the millennials. Today we don't line up for music, we don't need to, but also we don't want to because technology has replaced music as the hub around which social change occurs. The Arab Spring was driven by technology, tweets, social media. The push to have women drive in Saudi Arabia a few years ago was driven by social media. The London riots and the clean-up after the riots was driven by social media. Millennials look for high-tech wherever they go, and they don't notice it unless it's not there. There's no wow factor with millennials when it comes to tech. They don't look at a tablet like I do and say, wow, how did they get all that into a piece of glass? For them, it's just natural. I have 3 adult millennial children. They don't even think about it. There's no wow factor. They just have a very low tolerance for low tech. So we need to make sure that our industries and our businesses and our organizations have a high-tech component to them without the thing becoming the master. And they're using these technologies to form social enterprises like never before. In fact, the term social enterprise didn't exist till the millennials came along. Social enterprise, of course, is just a business that makes a profit solving a social problem. And I'm urging CEOs of large companies all around the world, wherever I get the chance, to set up social enterprises. For one reason, it's very attractive to millennials. Millennials like the idea of changing the world beyond the corporate front door. M-Pesa. Anybody here heard the name M-Pesa? Yeah. I was just in Africa again a couple of weeks ago. M-Pesa is all over Africa now. Do you know in the rural areas of Africa, there's a lot of people, but there's not many banks for those people to use. So 2 young millennial social entrepreneurs took some old school Nokia phones that we would have used 15 years ago and put some new school software in it that allows people to do basic transactions over long distances. And now 70% of all households in Kenya alone have at least one M-Pesa user. That's a social enterprise success, and it's just one I could talk about today. This is very important if you're a senior management in a company to think about this sort of thing. It's very attractive to millennials. Moving along quickly. It's a nurtured generation. When these guys appeared, they had entire toy factories devoted to them. They had entire book industries devoted to them. They had entire gaming industries, online gaming industries, devoted just to them. In surveys of CEOs that we've collected over a few years, some CEOs say, well, these guys are a bit overprotected. They're a bit hyper-nurtured. They're a bit brittle emotionally. They need a bit of reinforcement. They're a bit self-occupied. They're not interested in multi-generation. They just want their friends and their age group around them. Some have said they disregard authority, but expect a lot from authority. I'm not saying that that's the truth. I'm saying that's the perception. One thing that is true, though, is that millennials put a premium on trust. If you're the leader of a company, this is extremely important to you. They put a premium on trust. And because they put a premium on trust, they're looking for the new ethic. They're the ones pushing today for the new ethic. In universities, I sometimes get to lecture in, they are asking the big questions about technology versus humanity. Are we losing the line between the two as we invite biotech into our bodies through nanorobotics? They're asking questions about means versus ends. As we play with the gadgets, do we have time to think about where they're taking us, or are we just build faster machines to take us nowhere? They're asking the questions about future implications of present technologies and the law of unintended consequences. These are ethical questions, ladies and gentlemen. And it's the millennials that are driving the big debates now on economic ethics. In fact, if you spend any time in universities, you'll find that these guys have made pop culture heroes of professional ethicists. academics in the area of philosophy who major in ethics, people like Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard University, people like Professor Deborah Satz of Stanford University, are not rock stars. But for younger millennials, they are treated like rock stars on YouTube. Go and check them out, because they're talking about ethical dilemmas and building a market that serves us but doesn't define us. This is important. If we're going to engage, I feel like I'm competing with an opera. Yeah. It probably is an opera. Knowing this, it probably is an opera, isn't it?
Maybe you could try singing.
No, I don't think so. You wouldn't want to hear that. Trust culture is important if you want to reach and keep millennials. And can I say that if you want to increase the trust level as a leader of your company or business or sector, within your company or outside in the wider marketplace, there are 3 ways you can do it. The first, of course, is to increase your expertise. And can I say, when it comes to millennials, they're better educated than most of us who lead them. And they know it. But what they also know is they don't have what we call street smarts. It's the one area where millennials are looking for someone to help them. For example, they're not very good at negotiating. Because for millennials, they want to get to the convergent answer quickly. They want you to win and me to win fast. Let's do it quickly. They don't really understand or know how to mark out a position and work gradually towards that position. And they know it. So the expertise can also include street smarts. Integrity, of course, is another aspect of trust. But there's one other that I think has an even more multiplied effect, and that is our evident commitment to the common good. When Nelson Mandela first became president of South Africa, I've been going there for 25 years, I've seen so many changes there. He enlisted the support of a group of young white sportsmen with whom he had little in common. They played a game that he hated called rugby, which had been seen as a symbol of apartheid. But he knew that if he was going to build his image, his vision of a rainbow nation, he would have to enlist not only these young men, but their millions of supporters. So Mandela saw himself not as the president of black South Africa, or as the president of what they used to call coloured South Africa. He saw himself as the president of all South Africans. This is what in civic terms we call the common good. And it is very attractive to millennials that we as leaders demonstrate a commitment to the common good beyond the corporate front door. So I think millennials are looking for CEOs who are saying, what kind of city do I want to live in 10 years from now? How can I, through our enterprise, set that in motion? It's a narrative generation. McKinsey asked CEOs 3 years ago, what's the hardest thing for you to provide your team, but the one they want the most? And the biggest majority said meaning in the work, especially when it comes to younger people. And it is true, in an age of data overload, millennials are looking for some context. They don't just want to know what the company does, they want to know what we stand for. What's, if you like, our mission in life. It's a narrative culture. Almost every form of communication that comes to millennials has a story attached. If you think about it, whether it's a song is a story, a video clip is a story, YouTube is a story, Vimeo is a story, Snapchat is a story, Twitter is a story. The whole of social media is storytelling, stream of consciousness fashion. Narrative is a core part of millennials' wallpaper, the wallpaper of their lives. So we need to build narrative cultures to keep them and engage them, giving them the power of inclusion. When Churchill gave his June 9, 1940 speech, and it ended with, we shall fight in the beaches, we shall fight in the trenches, and so on. We remember those 4 lines and forget the rest, because in those 4 lines, the we shall is repeated 10 times. The power of inclusion is important when it comes to millennials. We together do this, and here's how you at your individual workstation are helping us. The sight line is drawn. Here's how you are helping us achieve this big picture vision. And of course, the greatest motivation is work that actually matters. Work that they can see leads to something. Again, yes, there's shareholder profit. Yes, there's the company doing well at the end of the year in its reports. But more importantly to millennials is, what does it do for the world? What impact does it have beyond our circle? Finally, on millennials, expectation gap. I left this to last with millennials. It's so important. Many millennials, there's a lot of research on this, have come out of school and university, to say the world that we were promised is not the world we inhabit. We were told by our parents, who are so supportive of us, that we will be wanted by every employer. We will be in demand at every level of society. And when we come out of university, instead we find ourselves paying education costs that maybe our parents didn't have to. They're facing pension pain today in Europe because the ratio of workers to retirees will halve over the next 40 years. There'll be twice as many people needing retirement age support, and half as many people to provide it. And millennials know they'll have to do it. There are challenges with housing. I don't have to tell you that if you come from anywhere in Europe. It's true of the big cities in many of European countries. But this is a cause of great frustration to millennials. It's one of the reasons, ladies and gentlemen, why some of you will spend a lot of money recruiting millennials, training millennials, only to find that after 2 years they go somewhere else. It's not just that they have short spans of attention, though they often do, and so do the rest of us who use social media a lot these days, including me. It's partly because they feel the windows of opportunity are closing quickly and they need to get in as much as they can. They need to tick as many boxes as they can while they've still got the chance. So we need to make sure that we have this big picture innovation culture, bringing these common good projects into the core of our strategy. Did you know, where millennials are concerned, CSR is dead? If you're still thinking and talking about old school CSR, forget about millennials. They won't last with you. They won't stay. No matter how much money you pay them, how good the holiday package is, because they're not interested in tacking this idea of the common good onto the rest of your... They want it in the center of strategic planning. So Orange realized this a few years ago and formed, some of you might have seen this, what I call a CSR partnership with Rockcore. Has anybody heard of Rockcore? Rockcore is very big in America. It's growing in parts of Europe. Rockcore set itself up simply to, quote, make volunteering cool. It says to millennials, we're going to put on big concerts in your city, but you can't buy a ticket and you can't win a ticket. You must give 4 hours of community service to earn a ticket, one ticket. And the amazing thing is, much to the shock of many corporate leaders who are watching this, it has sent out tens of thousands of people in the United States to give tens of thousands of hours to community service. London's the same. London has seen this. South Africa has seen this. Australia is now seeing this. And so Orange decided to get into the act, give itself some branding that would help it with millennials by forming an alliance with Rockcore. So for a while it was Orange Rockcore was the brand. It's smart thinking when it comes to millennials. And it doesn't have to be that complicated. It can just be what Levi Strauss does in the States, where they pay 5 hours a month for paid leave for someone to go and get involved in a volunteer project. I know for some of us that's a kind of head-spinning concept, but can I say to you it can be as simple as greening your office? Because 96% of millennials say they want to work in a green office which goes beyond minimum levels of environmental compliance. It can be as simple as that, trying to attract millennials. Okay, here we are for the last stretch. How are we going? All right?
Yep.
Sorry you're looking at your time, which is never a good sign. No. That's a seriously big clock. It's a seriously big watch. Okay, we got time. We got a few minutes left. There is one last major revolution taking place today, and it's the automation revolution. 12 years ago, Sony couldn't get a robot to walk. Today they can run, walk, and play football, at least better than I can. If you go to Sony today in Tokyo, you find they have an entire wing of their research laboratory set aside for what they call robot anthropology. The study of how robots will interact with us at every level of life. The US Navy now is debating seriously whether robots and AI machines can be taught to think morally and ethically. You might say machines can't think, but because of big data now, machines are improving their own programming, so in a sense they are already thinking. Automation is the big revolution facing Generation Edge. Generation Edge, remember, is aged between about 5 and 19 or 20 in Europe today. This is a very pragmatic generation, a bit like Generation X. It's wary of promises. It's seen millennials believing for the best and sometimes achieving or getting the worst. If you deal with Gen Edges, you'll find it takes longer time to build a bridge of trust with them than it did with millennials. They're a self-reliant generation, ambitious, driven, but they expect opposition. They don't expect it to be all rosy. They expect opposition and expect to be able to meet that with strength. They're a reformist generation. They believe that whistleblowers are the heroes in the story because whistleblowers are using technology to reform something. They don't see rebellion as some sort of cool behavior pattern, some image you put on like the Fonz. This, for them, rebellion is about reforming. It's a means to an end. And they're a conservative generation, ethically speaking. There's a number of studies, just even in the last 2 years in Europe, 2 in the UK alone over the last few months that have demonstrated this again and again. Do you know in the last 10 years, the drug abuse rates and alcohol abuse rates among teenagers in the UK have fallen dramatically. And there's no political or socio-economic factor at play that we can identify. The only thing we can put it down to is generational change. There's a different attitude, ethically speaking, to certain forms of, let's say, risky behavior. A couple of years ago, a young woman, 14 years of age, in the United States, managed to get 17 magazine to remove all images that had been photoshopped because she got 100,000 responses in an online survey. Around the same time, a group of young guys in the United States put together an app to help young black men report what they see as police brutality, all in the wake of the death of Michael Brown. Around the same time, a young woman in the north of England put together the No Makeup Selfie campaign, where women, including celebrities, would put photos of themselves online without makeup to raise money for cancer research. In 1 week, she raised £8 million, 8 million British pounds, for cancer research. This is a low-trust, big-noise generation. It distrusts institutions and wants to make a noise to change things, but it sees the digital space as its space for change. It will be unlikely that we will see a lot of these younger people coming out to demonstrate in the way that boomers did. Some will, but it won't be a mass thing. For them, the digital space is where they will make the biggest change. Which means if you're a CEO thinking future and you want to engage these generations that are the future, you have to be taking seriously what they're doing online. You have to be looking into their space online, looking at the apps they're building now, looking at the way they criticize things online in a way they would never do in face-to-face. We need to be taking this space very seriously indeed. I believe that Industry 4 is going to bring some great benefits to us, but it will bring some challenges for Generation Edge. One of them is underemployment. 230 million jobs will be lost in the next 20 years through automation. Now, it is true that technology breeds new jobs, but the question is, can we, as human beings, make transition quick enough, fast enough, between jobs as many times as will be expected to in the next 20 or 30 years? There will be challenges for Generation X with privacy. Big data is, after all, a form of soft surveillance. I don't know if you saw this in the news. Samsung Television last year put out a warning to anybody that uses their smart TVs. Did anyone see this? They said that because we're using voice recognition technology in our TVs, your conversations in the living room can be recorded and stored in the cloud. And now we're concerned that hackers are getting access to your conversations. Now, George Orwell would have loved that. Your TV is watching you. But it is part of the challenge of the automation revolution. So is biohacking. In Sweden today, there's a workstation called Epicenter that encourages its workers to have a chip implanted under their skin, usually in the arm, with which they can open the doors, the security doors. They can pay for their food in the canteen. They can get access to areas of the building. They can run the photocopier. And it sounds like a wonderful thing. No cards, no keys. How cool. Except that we have to consider any computerized device can be hacked, in theory. So do we want our bodies to be hackable and trackable devices? These are questions that Generation Edge is going to wrestle with. They're going to wrestle with digital debt, because as we remove the weightiness of cash completely from the equation and go completely cashless, it might mean that we encourage people to spend more without thinking about it first. Because if money is just binary code, of course, there is no weight to lose as you spend. There are challenges with time starvation. 75% almost now It's higher than two-thirds now. 75% of CEOs in the country I came from, Australia, cannot switch off after work because they're too hooked up to the internet. Some of you, I certainly, can relate. Do you know that 40% of children in Britain today who own a smartphone are sleep deprived? We should think about that before we buy our kids too much gadgetry, I guess. Cognitive function is a challenge for this new generation. How many of you have ever experienced absent presence? How many of you have ever been in a board meeting and you've got 10 people in the room and there's only 6 of them that are really there? Because the others are engaging in cyberspace. One study in Britain 2 years ago, JJ, found that 80% of the people doing that are messaging people in the same room. This is what psychologists now call absent presence. It has a name. We have the challenge of shallow think. This is a big one for Generation Edge. Because we multi-screen so much, we're learning to think shallow and broad rather than narrow and deep. Now, on one hand, it is good to have many ideas and be broad in your thinking, but you also need to be able to specialize in something in life. That, by the way, is one area where I believe CEOs and managers can help Generation Edge to develop, that ability to specialize and focus. We're nearly finished. In the face of autonomy, we have to build autonomous cultures. Sorry, in the face of automation, we have to build autonomous cultures. Cultures that humanize the digital. Strikes me as really interesting that in cities like Berlin today, which I really love, I was speaking at an innovation festival there just recently. I love Berlin. It's attracting all the cutting-edge game designers. Some of them are leaving Soho now to go to Berlin. The cutting-edge people on the very edge of technology are the ones who are driving the formation of physical innovation hubs, where people come together in proximity to share ideas and work together. See, these guys recognize, even if we don't, that in the age of high tech, we need high touch more than we did before. We need proximity with our technology. And we as CEOs and managers can help the younger people in this regard. You know, the Bank of America did this the end of last year. 90 of their workers were given censored badges and asked to go about their work for a week. At the end of the week, their data was analyzed. It was found the most productive workers in the biggest bank in the United States were those who mingled with other people the most. This meant the company changed its whole coffee room structure. So instead of people staying at the desk at their workstation having coffee, they were encouraged to go into better lit, more aesthetically pleasing, with better coffee lounges. And within 6 months, the Bank of America had seen a 10% boost in its productivity, and they attributed it to this. We need to be building autonomous cultures, especially when we consider the effect of automation on Generation Edge. Reflection cultures. The same areas of the brain responsible for daydreaming are the ones we use when we solve complex problems. Did you know that? It's why Einstein was an inveterate, unapologetic daydreamer right until he was an old man. Archimedes was the same. The classical records suggest so was Isaac Newton. We need to allow space for people to connect ideas, because innovation comes out of connections between old ideas. We need to give them imagination breaks now and again, encouraging them just to... Do you know the University of California found if you're doing a complex technical task and you go away for half an hour and do something imaginative, read a novel, listen to music, go for a walk, when you come back you will see a 40% boost in your productivity straight away, 40%. We need to allow space, especially for the digital generations, to have this sort of reflection time. And finally, we need to give them risk cultures. Did you know that Israel, as a nation, has more startups per head of population than any other nation on earth? And there have been a number of studies on this, and the only fundamental reason for it is that the army culture in Israel translates into corporate culture. Everybody has to go through national service in Israel, except some Orthodox Jewish people. And they carry the culture of the army into the corporate marketplace. And the culture of the Israeli army is very different to the British army, the American or the Australian army. It's not quite so hierarchical. Of course there are ranks, there are generals, there are privates, there are sergeants. But in the field, in the heat of battle, the private has the right to challenge the general if he or she believes they have a better idea or a better way of executing the plan. Why is that? Because the nation is under constant existential threat. And that atmosphere of risk creates an environment in which people begin to pull together and innovate. And I close with this. I remember in 1969, in my last year at primary school, watching on one television set at the front of the room, man's landing on the moon, Apollo 11. What most people don't know that is the 3 weeks before the Apollo 11 mission took off from the land base, the landing craft crashed and burned in a test run, almost killing Neil Armstrong. And I'm just thankful today there were no British health and safety people there, because though they do a good job in many areas, they would have closed the whole thing down as being way too dangerous, way too risky. Do you know NASA had a policy? We know we're going to fail, so let's fail fast, fix it fast, and move on fast. Fail fast, fix it fast, move on fast. That's a great culture when it comes to millennials and particularly Generation Edge. So what's our takeaway today? Well, I hope that in this time of me bombarding you with things, you'll go away believing that technology is not destiny. The future is a product of human choice. And with their different generational traits, Gen X, Millennials, Generation Edge, will shape corporate influence and innovation in very diverse ways, focusing on very different problems. We can get ahead of that curve as leaders by creating cultures to address those problems, and in that way begin to attract the very generations on whose shoulders the future will surely rest. Thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate you coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. We have a bit of time left to do some question and answers. The funny thing is, for the first time in 15 years, I'm actually stuck to a wire here. So I can't walk through the whole room. So please, if you have a question, I'll take a strategic position here, walk up to me and talk into my microphone. I have a first question for you, Mel.
Okay.
These people are presumably, most of them, in meetings and events. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. How does what you told us translate to meetings and events? What do they need to do with this information when organizing meetings and events?
Well, first answer is I don't like cutting up things so small that people don't have to think about them. That's why I didn't apply it directly to your sector. But I would suggest a couple of things, because it is a good question. The first is that with Generation Edge, we need to remember when it comes to the technology, they actually want to produce something with it. It's not games for them. They want to produce something with it. So we need to use technology in the travel industry even more than we do now, and there are some exciting things happening. I travel all the time, I know, in the technology area of this industry. But in our meetings, and particularly the travel side, we need to remember that for Generation Edge, they want an adventure that changes something. So we might want to build in some of those sort of have some ideas, some brainstorming sessions about what kind of change can people produce when they go on a trip, whether it's to do with green issues or to do with something else that concerns that generation. I think that's one area that we can start with.
Okay. I'm seeing if there is any questions. Not right away, because there's a few questions on screen coming in through Slido. One person said, what can employers do to retain millennials in their company for a longer time? Because you said they're gone after 2 years.
Yeah, they're gone after 2 years because, in part because of that expectation gap. But I think also what we can do is, I think millennials understand something, that even though they face great financial pressures today, their greatest asset is their skill set. And I think we produce enormous loyalty in millennials if we're willing to invest in this most valuable of their assets. So if I, as a leader, am investing in millennials' skill sets by bringing in people to train them in certain areas, training them myself in street smarts, for example, this is adding to something they value highly. Book smarts, I don't think they need so much, or they don't think they do. What they need is these areas of what we might call street smart. So I think investing in their skills is the primary thing.
Okay, thank you. And the second question on screen is, how can Generation X prepare millennials to become the future leaders, if they aren't already?
Yeah, well, the first, again, there's a long 3-hour answer to that, but let me give you the quick one. Generation X needs to understand, as boomers need to do with Gen X, how different millennials are. They're almost nothing like Generation X in their value system, some of their worldview. Of course, human beings fundamentally are the same, but the things that count in terms of their attitudes and ethics are quite different. So the first step in mobilizing that next generation to leadership is to understand they don't think like I do. They don't. So I've got to be open. I've got to learn to empathize, get inside their shoes a little bit, ask them questions, find out why they think the way they do. Then I've got something to work with. That's the short answer.
Thank you. At some point you mentioned the millennials being a very intelligent generation, and there were some people nodding in the room. I presume they were millennials. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? No more questions to Mel? In that case, I'm JJ from Masters in Moderation, but more importantly, he is Mal Fletcher. Give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you, JJ. Jay.